Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Policy Watch. Before we move on to the first story, the quick look at the headlines. The government gets set for disinvestment this year. Bail, Nalco, Hind Copper and SAIL among others identified for disinvestment this fiscal. The government says it's keen on a positive response from the markets. IIP numbers for the month of May are out. Slight improvement in industrial production. Despite a crippling strike, Air India manages an increase in revenues. Revenues up by 21%. Singapore and India all set to increase bilateral trade by 30 to 40% this year. Announcement comes as the Singapore PM comes calling. Those are the headlines, and our guest this week is Subhomoy Bhattacharjee, a deputy editor with the Indian Express now. Subhomoy, we'll go into our first story straight away, and this is our top story, of course, this week. Our top story this week, we start with an RSTV exclusive. The Disinvestment Secretary breaks down the disinvestment scenario in the country. I had a chat with Mohammad Halim Khan. Take a look. First of all, I would like to ask you about targets that we had set for this fiscal year for disinvestment. How far do you think we've gone, and how far have we achieved those targets? And what was the target in the first place?
For the year 2012-13, the budget has projected a disinvestment receipt of 30,000 crores. And as you know, that once these numbers are firmed up during the budget process, then we go into the preparation of the so-called roadmap. Now, in that we interact with large number of ministries which are in charge of CPSEs, government companies, and find out how the ministry and the company reacts to disinvestment in that company. So we have gone through that exercise, and we have broadly identified the companies which can be probably the candidates for disinvestment in this financial year.
Could you mention some of those companies?
Yes, for example, RINL, as you know, is appearing in the newspapers again and again. So they have, started the process. Then Steel Authority is also a candidate, but in that case you have to wait for the government authorization. Then Hindustan Copper is there. BHEL has got government authorization, and that is also in the pipeline. Similarly, we had got in principle agreement from the Defence Ministry with regard to the disinvestment of HAL, but the HAL board is under reconstruction, and because of that it is likely to take a little while. So a large number of companies we have identified. Yes.
As you said, sir, of course there are so many ministries involved, and there's a long, cumbersome process, and that's why sometimes it takes time. But the target, of course, was around 20. It was diminished from last year's budget because we couldn't meet that 40,000 crore target. Out of that target, how much has the disinvestment department managed to for a stake sale?
Basically, this year we have been able to get proceeds only from one issue, that was NBCC. It started on the last day of 31st of March, so money came into the beginning of this financial year, and that was a very small amount, 125 crores. If all these big ticket, disinvestment take place, then probably we can have a very sensible and good number in this quarter. Yeah.
So one last question to you. I know you're a busy man and you have other things to do, but do you think that the target that we have set for this year, is it realistically achievable, or should we not get our hopes too high? And which ones do you think will be the biggest big ticket options apart from SAIL?
See, you have to understand one thing, that you see, this is the part of, the improvement of governance, corporate governance, and the other part is the resource raising. Now, as far as the improvement in the corporate governance remains, the listing remains the priority, and the Department of Public Enterprises has also flagged this issue that when you sign MOU, the listing aspect should also be factored into the evaluation of a corporate governance aspect of a company. So that is some sort of a perennial requirement. Now, the other thing is about the resource mobilization. Now, in the case of resource mobilization, you have only two options. Either you do the asset sale or you borrow. Now, if asset sale is not feasible at some point of time because of the poor market conditions, and if the realization in the ministry is that the market is not offering the value of the company which it deserves, then there will always be a problem. And then instead of all procedural preparedness, etc., it becomes difficult to access the market. And in that case, for example, last year, now because of the market conditions, it was decided that some of the disinvestment proposals will not be good to pursue because of the prices being offered at that point of time.
So market conditions, of course, play a big role, of course.
That is the biggest player, that is the biggest decider. Yeah.
Right. Thank you so much, Mr. Khan, for joining us. That was Mr. Halim Khan, Disinvestment Secretary in the Ministry of Finance. That was Mohammad Halim Khan, the Disinvestment Secretary, of course, telling me that it could take perhaps another week before the cabinet or the CCEA gives its approval to sale. The delay, do you think, will hit any investor confidence or investor interest per se?
The delay will not hit investor confidence about sale, but it definitely will hit the government's time schedule. It's a very packed schedule. Khan was talking about 15 companies.
Right.
15 companies to be offloaded in a matter of just 9 months. It's frankly very difficult exercise. I don't think the government has the ability to move so many of them so fast.
Rather ambitious. And he was also mentioning that because there are so many ministries involved, it's a long and cumbersome process, and they have to get letters from ministries involved as well. There are also sometimes problems with volatility in the market, also problems with merchant bankers that they appoint for these sales. That also could take time, and perhaps 15 might not be what happens at the end of this.
True, but then, I mean, since when was any listing ever an easy exercise? And government knows that it has to go through with the ministries.
Right, right.
That's why we have a disinvestment department, which is supposed to be doing this thing while as a preparatory work. So that really can't be a very good excuse that why we are getting delayed. The delay is principally the fact that this market, because of the global factors and others, cannot absorb so many issues so fast, possibly at the price that the government would like to do.
Shiva, we talked about this before as well, I think yesterday. They have two options now, the OFS route or the auctions, the regular auction method. Which do you think the government would prefer for this particular company? Because SAIL is a solid company and the market response has been sort of positive as well. Which one do you think they'd
OFS, the problem is that, as we saw with the ONGC, that unless you handle it very carefully, you get to have you could land up with a problem in terms of the bid. Of course, SEBI has relaxed the rule to allow now that the guys who are bidding don't need to put in margin 100% upfront.
Right.
So that's a relaxation.
Right.
But definitely, it's not something that you can do for every one of the major issues. Probably for SAIL, it's a good idea, but not for others.
He also mentioned a couple of companies. You said around 15 companies that are scheduled to go to the markets this year. They include companies like BHEL, and Nalco, and Hind Copper, I think, as well. All solid companies, but no big-ticket money spinners, really, apart from perhaps SAIL, which I think only around 4,000 crore they're expecting.
Yeah, that's, I mean, Athar, you're right. But at the same time, all of these are good companies. And given the fact that the market in India is right now very thin, in fact, these could add quite a bit of depth. So definitely they are good ones as and when they come through.
Rashtriya Ispat Nigam Limited is also on the anvil, if I'm not wrong.
That's the first one that's supposed to be off the block.
Absolutely. And the gentleman mentioned that perhaps by the end of this month, that could also come through. Do you think that also having a sort of effect on investors like SAIL or perhaps ONGC before that? ONGC turned out to be a bit of a dud and they were carrying too many hopes on ONGC. But do you think RINL is anything different?
You know, one major joker in this entire market would be the fact that the funds that is available in the market right now is very tight. Plus, the government is carrying through a heavy borrowing program.
Right.
So, in terms of the money that is coming into the market is very, very limited. In the middle of all that, when you put in these, say that I want to mop up 30,000 crore, and remember along with it, there is also the spectrum auction. That will also come through. Now, these are solid numbers which can definitely create a huge pressure on a market where daily banks are borrowing to the tune of something like 80 to 90,000 crore.
Right.
So essentially, there isn't that much of money available. So for the government to expect that it will be able to move all these things together and still keep itself above water is frankly a very difficult matching exercise.
The target is 30,000 crore. It's looking increasingly difficult because even this sale is going to be around 4,000 crore. NBCC got them only 125 crore. And I don't think any of these companies that we just mentioned could perhaps overdo sale. So 30,000 is looking out of the question, isn't it?
Yeah, 30,000 is always difficult, and I don't think 30,000 was something that the government would really be able to come anywhere near. It was something that was put in by the finance ministry simply to ensure that the fiscal deficit didn't cross 6%. Realistically, anything above 15,000 would be a huge rise.
Right, right. Talking about flows coming in and investors actually putting money where their mouth is, April to June, the numbers are not so great. $350 million apparently investors took out of stocks. What is there any indication that that disinterest might not continue and perhaps investors will?
Yeah, I mean, all of these things. So essentially what we are doing is we have got so many of imponderables on the play. We want to do disinvestment, but we've got a fund problem in terms of the fact that the market is very tight, the government is itself borrowing. Simultaneously, by the process of uncertainty on guard, we have created a problem where FII investment as it is down. The fact that the international markets are not looking very great, no one really wants to do too much of exposure anywhere beyond where they are, would definitely affect. So it's essentially ensuring that in every stage, you got to sort of think whether this now is going to be there.
Right.
And simultaneously, when these issues come, there's also the question that whether anybody who's bringing in a private issue, whether that person or that company would feel confident enough to sail through.
Right, right. We'll take a small break here, Subhomoy. We'll come back with the next story on the agenda. Of course, don't go anywhere. More on Policy Watch on the other side of this break. Welcome back to Policy Watch. We're still in conversation with Subhomoy Bhattacharjee. Subhomoy, there's a slight good news for the government. IIP numbers in May have picked up. We'll go to the story and we'll come back to the discussion. Now, India's industrial output picked up more than expected in May, bolstering the case for the Reserve Bank of India, RBI, to keep the monetary policy unchanged at its next policy meeting, as a slow start to the monsoon puts pressure on inflation. We pile the package. Take a look.
In an unexpected development, the index of industrial production numbers for the month of May grew by 2.4%. Analysts had expected a growth of around 1.8%. This is the largest growth in output since the month of February. According to the data released by the government, basic goods grew 4.1%. Consumer goods grew 4.3%. However, the capital goods sector registered a decline in output of 7.7%. The index of industrial production is taken as a barometer of economic growth, which fell to 5.3% in the quarter up to March, the slowest pace in 9 years. Along with June wholesale price inflation, the volatile IIP data could be instrumental for the Reserve Bank of India to take a call on the rate cuts at its next policy meeting on July 31st. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV.
There you go. Some good news at last for the government, although we can't read too much into it, can we?
Yeah, and it's just one of the numbers are still looking very wonky. If you look at it in terms of the industrials, if you break it down in terms of the particular industries,
right,
then you see that the major industries are not doing very well. And that definitely means that there are huge gaps there in terms of industry still coming back on steam. In fact, there are no indication that industry is coming back on steam. If you look at the latest credit offtake numbers, that's down to 6.5%. The RBI data released the day before. It was 19.9% the year before. So essentially, it doesn't show that there's people taking money out of the banks to invest. So essentially, for IIP to be able to reflect I would think it's more of a correction for probably errors and others which were there earlier.
So we can't read too much into it, of course, and you don't really see this as a sudden spurt in growth. It's just a correction, like you just said.
2.4% is hardly a spurt. Yeah, of course, considering that we were practically growing at negative. In fact, the April figures have been reduced from 0.1% to minus 0.9.
Right.
So essentially, that means that there is a lot of element of errors and data, and it's happening because the base has narrowed so much that measuring it is becoming very difficult. You know, you're actually measuring very nominal rise at most levels. So essentially the numbers are becoming very, very wonky at this level.
We had a late monsoon start. Inflation will get affected by late monsoon, obviously. Where do you think this sudden spurt in the monthly figures in IIP numbers, do you think that's case enough for the RBI to actually perhaps reconsider not cutting the rates in its August meeting? You think RBI is going to stick to its stand?
Yeah, RBI is in a position of damned if you do, damned if you don't. Yeah. The problem is that essentially there is only that much which the rate cuts will do. Sure enough, they'll definitely reduce the pressure in terms of the cost of money. There's no doubt that the cost of money is very high. So even those who might want to set up a new project are basically wondering that in the current climate with such a high costly money, whether it makes sense.
Right.
So to definitely that extent, RBI, a bit of a rate cut would definitely help. That is assuming that everything else, all the governments, all the plans, policies and others start moving.
So RBI is basically stuck between a rock and a hard place and they can't really do much. Also, slightly off topic, but I wanted to ask you about GAR since you mentioned it in the beginning. The Prime Minister's office has been releasing clarification after clarification. It's been delayed as well. There was this whole mess about the PMO distancing itself from the GAR issue and R.S. Gujral, the Finance Secretary, coming out and saying something else. Do you think the lack of clarity on the GAR issues also try and playing its part in making investors shy off and obviously linking it to growth in industry?
Yeah, what has happened is GAR has already done the damage. So it has already made investors wonder, foreign investors wonder whether the government would where does it stand? At one stage before the budget came, there was the understanding that GAR would come in next year and people were preparing for it. The budget changed the equation to say no, it will come in right now.
Right.
So, and now after the clarification, we know that it's not going to come in anytime soon. So essentially, it's opening up a huge area for lobbying, a huge area for uncertainty, and that is definitely not good for the economy.
So obviously that issue also that the Prime Minister, since he is in charge of non-block now, must also address sometime soon. IIP numbers, we've been talking to economists every time and they say don't look at monthly figures, don't look at weekly figures. You should look at yearly figures, and even then our data is wrong. Do you think any such problems exist with the data still? We've had this conversation before, but do you think the data and the quality of the data make any difference whatsoever?
Well, I mean, there's no doubt about the fact that there is a slowdown. So 2.4 at most can be 2.7 or 2.6. That's about it. I mean, I wouldn't expect the error to be that much in terms of, pushing it on that we are actually growing at 5% and this is showing 2.4%.
Right.
Nothing of that sort. It's broadly showing the thing. What is it not showing is that because of the measurement problems, as Athar you're saying, there is a problem in terms of even understanding that whether the corrections would swing which way.
Right.
So there is so essentially that and it's rather sad because we had a very solid statistical system and it was a sort of a trendsetter in Asia.
Very briefly, where do you see inflation going? Any indicators that might tell us something that inflation is going to stay for a while?
The problem is that right now, if the monsoon fails, the government will have to come in with drought relief measures. That essentially means cash moving into the economy.
Right.
Once cash moves in, and that will be to the consumption sector. So once cash moves into the rural areas, to the lower people, to the poor people, then essentially what happens is that cash multiplies into basically a demand for food and vegetables.
Right.
So essentially, I don't see a bad monsoon as a good indicator for inflation to come down. It'll actually push inflation.
Right. We'll take another small break, come back with the third story of the week. Take a small break, come back. We'll come back with the story on Air India and how it's turned profit even during the 58-day strike. Come back and we'll take a look at that. Welcome back. Now, despite a crippling 58-day strike, national carrier Air India has seen their revenues rise 21% in the April-June quarter. In what comes as a shocker to supporters and critics, both the airline managed to push their top line by 3%, even though it operated on a truncated schedule for the best part of that period. It might not be a massive revival, but the beleaguered Maharaja has something to cheer about at least. The airline has accumulated losses of 24,000 crore and the company debt pile stands at 67,000 crore currently. With more than 200 pilots on strike, Air India's revenue were hit by a 600 crore loss during that strike period. Now, Subhomoy, this is surprising. They were on a 58-day strike. They pushed their top line by 3%. What's happening?
Essentially, it's just proving what the analysts have been saying, that, Air India is flying a lot, which is basically uneconomic. So when it's been forced to cut down that,
only on the profitable routes.
It's only for flying the profitable route.
Right.
So obviously the numbers start changing.
Right.
I mean, it's something that makes basic sense.
Right, and it's simple economics, of course, like you said. Also, it'll come as a morale booster for the whole airline. It's been down in the dumps, the management problems with the employees and the salaries, and overall management of issues, of course. It might not be much cash-wise, but it would be a good morale booster, wouldn't it?
Sure. I mean, it just tells the airline that what it needs to do, except that it's not something that it can do. But probably the fact that it's not picking up many of the routes where it doesn't make sense, it doesn't pick up too many pilots to fly, too many stuff, basically rationalizing, redeploying its personnel, which it was forced to do. If it can keep on doing it.
Do you also think the airfare hike that happened during that strike also was responsible, because Air India started filling up seats during that period?
Well, it initially it didn't. So essentially, I don't think the airfare hike, but what it did was that the government because the government has committed a cash subsidy, what it is able to do is it's able to undercut. And for a considerable amount of time during the first quarter, it has undercut its other competitors. Now, that's not something what you call a correct pricing of tickets. But that is why its PLF went up.
Right.
Because its prices were lower, and the prices were lower because it is able to offer lower price because there was a taxpayer's money coming in. So that was allowing it to do better. That's frankly, it's not economics. It's simply like you're using currency to fill it up.
Right. One last question, Subhomoy, for this week's show. Of course, the aviation sector in general is in the news for the wrong reasons altogether. The DGCA has been axed among in dubious circumstances. Kingfisher is digging hole after hole for itself. No wonder then FII investors, even if FDI in aviation comes, no one wants to touch the aviation sector.
True.
I mean, is there any way out of it?
No, it can if they won't touch the aviation sector, but there are lots of things around the aviation sector, ground handling, storage, engineering operations. Those are good profitable operations which people might like to do.
Right.
Flying a plane, no.
On that note, Subhomoy, we thank you so much for joining us on Policy Watch this week. That was Subhomoy Bhattacharjee, Deputy Editor with the Indian Express. Of course, our top story this week, we spoke to Disinvestment Secretary Mohammad Halim Khan, and he outlined the challenges that he faces as Disinvestment Secretary. As he did point out, there are about 12 to 15 companies, PSUs that are on the anvil for disinvestment this year. We'll have to wait and see how many of those the government actually manages to offload equity in. Our second story this week was IIP numbers, slight improvement, 2.4%. That's not really a huge improvement per se, and like Subhomoy said, it can't be counted as a sudden spurt in growth. Perhaps it's just a correction for previous areas. And our third story this week on Policy Watch was, of course, Air India turning slight profit, even though during the strike, like Subhomoy mentioned, it could be perhaps because their schedule was truncated and they were forced to fly only on profitable routes, perhaps something that they might want to look at in the future as well. Thank you so much for joining us on Policy Watch this week. Till next week, thank you and goodbye.